Today I'm looking at a feature in the Blackmagic camera app that has caused a little bit of confusion out there. Alright, just wanted to look at one feature in the Blackmagic camera app that is not really intuitive. You would think it would be, but it's a little bit confusing. And I've seen other videos on YouTube that have mistakenly identified this as the wrong feature, although I can understand why they did that. And that is setting the exposure and the actual exposure control, as Blackmagic calls it. It's a plus minus right here, and it looks like exposure compensation. And it is similar to exposure compensation. For instance, on the native camera app, you have exposure compensation. I've got it set to -0.3 right now, and it has a plus minus. And so you can come in here and you can adjust that. In my experience, the iPhone tends to overexpose a little bit, especially in auto settings. So I do -0.3 or -0.7. Well, similar in Blackmagic, they have a plus and minus. But if you look more closely, it is not exposure compensation. And if it is, it doesn't work like traditional exposure compensation, where it's like a master control or an override. So no matter what you set the shutter and ISO at, the exposure compensation will do whatever you tell it to do, like -3 or -0.7, etc. And this particular one does it by 3 stops. And so when I first started using the app, I thought it was exposure compensation. Blackmagic calls it exposure. And if you look closely, when I'm dialing this around, it's actually affecting the shutter and the ISO. Those are moving, which on a phone is how you set exposure because the iris is fixed. And so that makes sense. But here's what doesn't make sense. When I go to lock the shutter, like on 180, I'll lock it. And that's really what I tend to do more times than not on a smartphone because I want to get proper motion blur. Now, when you go back to exposure compensation, or again, that's what you think it is, it's now an ISO control. So now the shutter is locked, but the ISO is being controlled. So if you had set a exposure compensation before that, if you unlock the shutter and go back to that, it's to 0. And so whatever you set there doesn't stay. So it doesn't act like true exposure compensation. And then the other thing, if you want to hit auto there, you've got an A next to ISO and an A next to shutter. And so now you're in full auto exposure. So if you adjust this, that's doing it manually, and you can see the ISO and the shutter moving. But if you were to move the camera around, you get automatic settings, which you never really want to do. Very rarely would I ever shoot with auto settings. But then if you notice, it does now act like exposure compensation when you're using the auto mode, which is like the native camera app. So it's definitely kind of weird, like they blended multiple controls into one. I would like to have auto ISO. That way you could lock the shutter on 180 and then you could have a constant shutter speed, and it would be nice to be able to potentially ride the ISO occasionally. Although again, I rarely use auto exposure. So really this has caused a little bit of confusion for myself included, that in reality, this is not exposure compensation. It is actually just controlling the overall exposure. So I would look at it as like a master exposure control that affects both ISO and shutter simultaneously, but you can't set it and leave it unless you're in full auto mode. So it's just a little bit of a different way than you do that in other apps. And now I hope that makes better sense. By the way, I've been doing a deep dive into the Blackmagic camera app, and I'm working on a new course. It's not ready yet, but it will be in the near future. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the link in the description. Thanks for watching. This is Blake Calhoun. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.